right. Good evening, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is another installment of our podcast, Street to the Statehouse. This is essentially a legislative update where we're going to give you just our assessment of where we are in the Maryland General Assembly at this stage. We're at that point in session where, there's a lot more things to be updated about. There are a lot of moving parts. So part of what this is designed to do is to provide some people with some perspective on how to do that. So before I do that, let me say a few things just by introduction again for people who may not be familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank, advocate on the interests of Black people unapologetically with a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective and worldview that kind of guides our work. That's important because we navigate political space from the vantage point of recognizing that if Black people are going to achieve freedom, it's going to happen as a result of our collective sovereign activity and pursuing our own capacity to be independent. And if we think about the society that we live in, structural racism and white supremacy, and the plantation framework that currently exists, where those who are owners of the economy, the descendants of those that benefited from chattel slavery and all the forms of oppression and domination that people of African descent and other peoples of color experience, currently own the economy today and play a big part in controlling the nature of the kinds of politics that are made most available to us. And so the importance of this podcast is that we represent a perspective that traditionally is omitted or obscured from the political landscape, and proud of the fact that we're in a position to have an impact on the political landscape as a result of our track record of work over many years, again, being guided by this perspective. So it's important, the conversation, the discourse of this podcast is important because this is a perspective and because of our deeply informed work and being connected to what's happening in the state legislature. It's a key aspect of the work and the perspective that we bring and why this podcast is so important. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk about a couple of elements of our legislative agenda and where things are. I'm going to talk about some other legislative issues that we're paying attention to and where those issues are. I want to first, though, talk about two kind of overarching elements of, the political landscape in general, because these two kind of major overarching points will, I think, put in perspective much of what I'm going to discuss when we get to the specific legislative items that I want to address. So first is that, as a person who, has done legislative advocacy for many years at this point, when you're actually engaged in the arena of politics, an arena of politics is a contact sport. It is not merely just something that's about just giving commentary or, your opinions or ideas or going to make speeches. But politics is a contact sport, which requires a tremendous amount of attention to detail. It requires a tremendous amount of understanding certain processes and tactics and strategies and navigating these systems. And so to be engaged in the policy making arena is a unique experience because once you're acclimated to it, you develop a sense of what works. You develop a sense of what there is political tolerance for, right? You're able to create a metric where you understand what are the limits of the politics that are available, and they're able to then judge your success based on how close you're able to get to whatever your ultimate goal is. One of the things that happens is that as you become a person who's familiar with the legislature and the political process in general, and if you've been able to get certain victories, one of the things that begins to happen is that for many people adjust. They adjust in ways that they normalize the nature of the society we live in and the politics that undergird it. And I want to start with that because, one of the things that we deal with, and one of the things that we're super clear about, is that we live, as I mentioned, we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy. America is a settler colony. So I'm clear, even though I have an understanding of the political tolerance for certain issues that the political mainstream has, I am very clear that even things that we've done in the past that have been successful, that have been really important pieces of legislation, in many ways only scratch the surface as it relates to what this society needs to actually move closer to a transformed society. So I'm really clear about that. And it can be easy, particularly sometimes even for legislators, it can be easy because of all the pressures and how difficult it is to move many of these legislative efforts. It can be easy to believe that certain pieces of legislation that might do good things, right, rises to the status as racial justice. So I wanted to start with that because that to me is indicative of the fact that the extent of the suffering of working class Black people in Baltimore and in the state of Maryland is enormous. And unfortunately, there's a way that that suffering is normalized. That oftentimes what happens is that Black working class folks and the suffering that many folks in our community face serve as symbolic capital that liberals and Democrats use without actually having to deliver on policy that substantially impacts the community, but just do enough that it's not disruptive of the political establishment, but do enough such that they can claim some kind of victory. And this is the classic tactic of liberals, right? The classic tactic. Well, what they do is that they put a veneer of trying to achieve justice, again, while maintaining the very systems as they exist. And there's a way that the suffering of working class Black people can be rendered invisible. All the distraction of social media, right? All the distractions of pop culture can make it easy to forget the fact that, for instance, and I'll talk about more of this later, things like kids in the adult prison system, right? Or the hundreds of people who are behind bars that would be better served outside of prison being productive members of society. People who are behind bars who had racist criminal proceedings, right? That have been there for 30, 40 years and deserve a shot to be with their families. Whether we're talking about things like expungement. So I'm going to get into the specifics later, but I wanted the extent of the suffering that working class Black people face is enormous, and it is easy for it to become normalized. And there's a way. So this bleeds into the second thing I want to say is a bigger picture. As a person who does legislative advocacy, and I end up having to go to a bunch of the galas and fancy events and whatnot, because that's a part of where business is done. That's where business is conducted. And there's a way that it creates a culture where there's a particular theory of change that I think for a lot of people becomes, again, normalized, becomes the way that they approach what progress for Black people means. And I want to talk about this in the context of Governor Westmore. And for the purpose of this podcast, I'm not going to go in depth in terms of the policy positions of the Westmore administration for the moment, because that's really its own discussion. But what I want to talk about, though, is the impact of those who have aspirations, political aspirations for him nationally, and the impact that has on the local political landscape. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand and to provide, again, context with some of the specific things we're going to talk about. The theory of change that I think Black people consistently are sucked into is this theory of change that we need this exceptional Black person to occupy the seat of power. And if they occupy that seat of power, they're able to change things from the inside. And we need a Black person who is appealing enough to people outside of our community, primarily white folks. A person that is appealing enough to folks outside of our community that can get in that position. And then we can ride the wave of that individual person's political ascension and be able to do more from that. And that theory of change is a theory of change that not only does not work, history says it doesn't work. I'll get to that in a second. Not only does it not work, it actually can make things for Black people worse. Because in trafficking in the symbols of progress, of individual people, and there's a way that folks oversell what an individual Black person in a high office can do for the community. Overselling that creates a context where, again, the masses of our people continue to suffer, right? Because an individual person in one executive seat, right, or in one political position cannot engage in the political warfare needed to deliver for our community. And typically, the Black folks that tend to appeal most to a broader audience tend not to be Black folks that will explicitly be engaged in the political warfare against a settler, colony, white supremacist society that is necessary to deliver for Black people. And so I think there's a way that the discussions about the potential national political aspirations of Westmore create a context where the Democratic Party establishment is going to be conservative on certain issues as its analysis of what the national 2024 election means. So you've heard in many respects what amounts to a Cold War within the Democratic Party. And it's a Cold War that's been ongoing for a while. But this last 2024 presidential election, in many ways, added a new layer to this Cold War. And this Cold War being that there's a wing of the Democratic Party, a progressive wing, a left-leaning wing, that advocates for policies that more directly impact and improve the quality of life of working class people in general, right? And for our purposes, working class Black people. And so, and there are ways, and we've written in the past about the ways that the agenda of the legislative agenda of LBS overlaps with the progressive agenda and ways that it contrasts, right? So that's its own thing, and we've written about that in the past. But for the purposes of this conversation, there's a way that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, whose policies are more impactful for working class Black people, clashes with a moderate corporate wing of the Democratic Party. And so that is an existing Cold War. There's a lot being said about that on a variety of different platforms. And so what has happened is that the Trump election by the Democratic Party establishment has been weaponized and used to say that it is having to appease the progressive wing that has created the environment where Trump is able to be elected president. And therefore, the Democratic Party needs to distance itself from the progressive left-leaning wing of the Democratic Party in order to be able to have a chance at being competitive in national elections. What that has done, that is a fallacy. And there are lots of conversations that I think could be had in terms of why that is a fallacy. I think one of the most important things is that when you look at working class Black people, if the Democratic Party were to deliver for working class Black people, then it would be in a position electorally to be able to win, not just national elections, but be able to win in places that it otherwise would not be able to win, that in ways that it otherwise would not be competitive, if it took seriously the importance of investing in the kind of electoral infrastructure to get out working class Black people. The problem is that should the Democratic Party do that, they would be relinquishing control, right? Major aspects of control of the party to Black people in ways that there's a white elite consulting class that doesn't want to concede that power, right? And that's an aspect of it that doesn't get talked about enough. But there's an elite, mostly white, multiracial, but mostly white, elite consulting class of the Democratic Party that has been able to make a living off of advising the Democratic Party, and they ultimately work for donors, for whom many of them are opposed to many of the progressive policies that one would characterize the Democratic Party. So that's important because this kind of Cold War is being brought into Maryland through many of the political decisions and calculations that are being made as a way to protect the governor. And what that ultimately means is protect his political aspirations, having to consider the national political landscape in Maryland in a way that doesn't match Maryland's political landscape, right? Maryland is a place that has a sizable Black population, about 30%, sizable, Latino population, about 11 to 14%, a Democratic Party where the rank and file is majority people of color. I mean, that's why we've had, Maryland has had a Black nominee for governor in the past 3 gubernatorial cycles. So it says something that we're in a state where Black people and people of color make up a majority of the rank and file. And so that's important because what that is doing is the potential national political aspirations of Westmore and it being brought into Maryland is creating an environment where Democrats are going to be conservative on things because of their calculation as to what they take from the national election with Trump being in the White House. I'll also add that what an additional aspect of that is the way that the Democratic Party in Maryland, right, continues to engage. It continues to engage Sinclair Broadcasting. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that, and you've heard us, and, it's not a secret, the criticism that my organization, that LBS has had of David Smith, the owner of Sinclair, executive chairman of Sinclair Broadcasting, who's also one of the majority owners of the Baltimore Sun. It is no secret that his political agenda is aligned with Donald Trump, right? So that's not a secret, right? It is a concern, and at this point, Sinclair Broadcasting, in partnership with the Baltimore Sun, given David Smith being the common denominator in both platforms, is behaving more, particularly Fox 45, as a right-wing political advocacy organization masquerading as media. And the Democrats seem to be very passive in its response to Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith. And what that leads to is that it seems that in many ways Democrats agree more with Donald Trump than they would like you to believe. That as much as they pretend to be so horrified about what Trump represents in the White House, right? A conservative, right-wing, white nationalist political perspective that Trump and his political machine operates from, that the Democratic Party agrees with Trump more than it would like to admit. And I'm saying that because of the way that the Democratic Party is not aggressively fighting Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith the same way that rhetorically it's fighting Donald Trump, especially given the impact that Sinclair Broadcasting has in Maryland over the legislature. So the fact that the Democratic Party in many ways is capitulating to Sinclair Broadcasting, to Fox 45, right? It is capitulating to them in ways that if it were Donald Trump, as Sinclair has expressed itself as a conduit for Trump's message, if they were serious about pushing back against the underlying politics that Trump represents, then they would at least equally, given the fact that it is a local political force, fight against David Smith and Sinclair Broadcasting. But they seem to be playing ball with them, right? In ways that again, demonstrate some overlap, in ways that in many respects, they wouldn't like people to know about the nature of how they operated. So I wanted to start with those two kind of general points, because these points, I think, will help then in terms of the analysis of the legislative efforts that we're watching, and will give you a sense, because, again, I'm going to talk about some of these specific pieces of legislation, some of these particular legislative efforts. And it's important to note that many of these things should be baseline, bare minimum. Like, if the Democratic Party believed in Black people and believed in addressing the concerns of working class Black people, then many of the things that I'm going to address should be easy. But because of the nature of the true nature of the Democratic Party's ideological worldview and what its allegiances are, it's the only explanation for its limitations. So let's talk about some of the specific legislative issues. So I want to start with one of the major areas that we focus on the past couple of years. Has been in the area of juvenile justice. And as I mentioned, Sinclair Broadcasting, David Smith, Fox 45, and the Baltimore Sun, that we've seen a level of coverage of quote unquote juvenile crime in a way that is undergirded by a political agenda. So for those, if you take some time to look back at the coverage from about 2023 on, you will see a lot of explicit coverage of quote unquote juvenile crime. And then attached to those stories, you'll see stories about the impediments that law enforcement feels was created by the Child Interrogation Protection Act. For those who aren't familiar, that bill was passed in 2022, became law, Child Interrogation Protection Act. That bill required that when a police officer engages in a custodial interrogation of a young person, that the parent is notified, and that that young person consults with an attorney before participating in a custodial interrogation. The purpose of this is to ensure that the rights of that young person are protected. A lot of people don't realize this, but it is lawful, for instance, for law enforcement to lie to a person, right? So you would at least want, particularly a child that is probably intimidated, scared, and in this state, the majority of the people who law enforcement interact with that are young or Black. And so when you think about the fact that all those dynamics, you will want an extra layer of protection, protect the rights of youth, particularly in a state where most of these youth are going to be Black youth. And so we've heard, for instance, from the Harford County Sheriff, right, blaming the Child Interrogation Act for impediments dealing with the investigation of a shooting that happened, in the fall of last year, or in the summer of last year. What's interesting about that, as I've discussed in previous podcasts, is a public safety exception. So that if there's imminent danger is an exception to the law, which was actually something that we didn't want in the bill, but ultimately ended up in what passed, right? Just to give you a sense of the level of disinformation. Sinclair Broadcasting made it a point to mention this bill incorrectly as an impediment to dealing with public safety in their coverage of juvenile crime. And in fact, I believe it is a Sentencing Project report that did an analysis of media coverage of quote unquote juvenile crime and found that Fox 45, about over 50% of its coverage was on quote unquote juvenile crime, right? And in many ways, it is driving the larger media ecosystem in that direction. So that's important to note in terms of the impact that this is having, that Sinclair Broadcasting is having on the legislature. Now, one of the things on our legislative agenda was to protect the Child Interrogation Protection Act. There was a bill, I mentioned it on the last podcast, sponsored by Senator Folden, that essentially would have gutted the Child Interrogation Protection Act. That bill doesn't seem to be getting any traction. And it seems pretty clear to me, particularly given the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, Senator Will Smith, has made it clear on a variety of occasions that no changes, no repeal of Child Interrogation Protection Act would come out of his committee. So that part of our legislative agenda we think is fairly secure. Again, I want to highlight this is something that was difficult to pass. It took a few years to get it through. And the fact that we're having to continue to protect something as basic as a protection for youth, again, should say something about the state of Maryland politics, that is something that not only was it difficult to pass, but continues to be something that we have to continue to watch to ensure that it is protected, because there are attempts at wanting to take it away, right? So that's one aspect of our legislative agenda. But on the issue of juvenile justice, one of the things that we have been working on is so Maryland is one of the few states that still engages in the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. So there are about 30 or so charges that if a young person is charged with any of those charges, that they are automatically put into the adult system. A young person in the adult system is not entitled to mental health services, not entitled to education, and they're in prison with adults. And there are many contexts where they're supposed to be sight and sound from adults. So it functionally, in many ways, is the equivalent of solitary confinement. So these are extremely dehumanizing circumstances. What is also important to note is that about 75% of the young people who are automatically put into the adult system end up being waved back down to the juvenile system anyway, right? So these are young people that spent sometimes several days, several weeks, several months in the adult prison system. It's being subject to this dehumanizing experience for long periods of time, who then are waved back down to the juvenile system anyway, right? This is the kind of dehumanization that we should not want our kids subject to, particularly those that, again, are way back down to the juvenile justice system anyway. But this is a practice that Maryland engages in, and one of the few states that continues to engage in this practice. It's also important to note that Maryland incarcerates the highest percentage of its children of any state in the country except Alabama, and that Black youth are 2.5 more times likely to be in the juvenile, to be incarcerated. Right. So Maryland, even though it's supposed to be a progressive blue Democratic Party bastion, is one of the worst states, right, as it relates to actually dealing with as it relates to dealing with youth and the way that youth are dehumanized and criminalized, right, as a result of the juvenile justice system. In fact, in 2024, there were 529 young people who were charged as adults that were way back down to the juvenile system. That's 529 young people who the system decided didn't belong in the adult system, but were put there first. That's 529 young people in 1 year who are subject to the dehumanization of the adult prison system. And so again, I want to highlight one of the things that I mentioned in the very beginning, that the level of dehumanization that's normalized, the people who know that know that damage are the families and the young person. But those stories don't get the same level of exposure as the stories of violence and brutality that get played over and over again by Sinclair and Fox 45. And one thing I must say, a show that I've actually been on a few times, well, this iteration that I've been on once, C4 and Brian Newman's show on WBAL radio. And on their show, you know, I had a chance to engage them, right, on the issue of juvenile crime. And I'm looking forward to an opportunity to come on and to engage them again. Because one of the things that them and that also you hear on Fox 45 is a conversation, and they quote, you know, Ivan Bates, the Baltimore City State's attorney, and talking about victims. And one of the things that I've said on numerous occasions is that we should care about the harm done to people who experience robberies, you know, carjackings, brutal beatings. Those should be just as important as young people who are put in an adult prison facility who the system said that they don't belong because they were way back down. But we should care just as much about both. And that the policy that we advocate for is to end the practice of automatically charging youth as adults, leaving open the ability for young people to be weighed up to the adult system if necessary. This does not impede the ability to hold people accountable. And this is one of the things that is one of the most frustrating narratives as it relates to criminal justice in general and the juvenile justice reform work as well, which is that none of the things that we are advocating for impair the ability to hold, quote unquote, hold people accountable, lock people up who engage in violent brutality, right? That does not change, right? So let's talk a little bit about like what the objectives when we talk about juvenile justice and the point, like what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Well, I just gave you a number, 529 young people in 2024, fiscal year 2024, were in the adult prison system. The goal of this work is because it is clear that there are too many young people in the system who would be better served outside the system. And so part of the goal is to create policies such that we can ensure that there are as few young people in the system as possible, right? That we put young people who would otherwise be better served outside the system. And those who belong in it, right? We can have a discussion about what that even means. But at a very baseline, people who harm the community, who are put in the system, right? Who belong, makes sense. But even those who are on the side of law enforcement will tell you that those that wreak havoc in the community represent a very small percentage. So we're talking about a system where there are too many people who are incarcerated, who suffer the impacts of being incarcerated. So it's important to note that the work to stop the automatic charging of youth as adults does not impair the ability to prosecute young people that are presenting harm to the community. But in fact, taking an example of, you think about a kid whose sibling asked them to hold a gun, who's an otherwise good student that doesn't get in trouble, who gets caught with the gun in their book bag, right? That kid doesn't make sense that they would automatically need to be put in adult prison, right? That is an intervention that makes more sense for the community and the family and the school. That is the more appropriate intervention because that's not a kid who is a driver of violence in their community, neighborhood, or school, right? And so the whole point of moving a policy that would end the automatic charging of youth as adults is to make sure that that kid does not get harm done to it. And again, those kinds of examples, the one I just gave, are more common than the extreme examples of brutality and violence that get looped over and over and over again on Fox 45. In fact, when you listen to Scott Schellenberger, who is the state's attorney of Baltimore County, he gives you the same handful of extreme examples of violence committed by young people when he testifies, right? And he always picks the most extreme examples, but the vast majority of young people in the prison system are not that. This is another one of those things that should be easy. Like, if the Democratic Party in Maryland is committed to Black people, working class Black people, this is a policy that should be easy. We've testified that we want to fully repeal the practice. We have supported an effort, Senator Will Smith, chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, a bill that reduces the number of charges that automatically put young people in the adult system. And that, based on information from the Department of Juvenile Services, would deal with about 73% or so of the young people in adult prison, which is a step forward. Ultimately, that practice should be banned altogether. But we have been saddled with having to rely on that as the primary vehicle for our advocacy on this issue. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened in the very beginning of session is that Senate President Bill Ferguson represents Baltimore City. He has said that he is not likely to put a bill on the floor that would address anything around juvenile crime, quote unquote, juvenile justice or juvenile crime. It is my belief that this is a political calculation. That, and again, going back to the environment created by Sinclair Broadcasting and Fox 45, I think it is a political calculation. And so one of the things that's going to be extremely important for those in Baltimore City or those around the state that are interested on this issue, it's going to be really important to press Bill Ferguson to put this on the floor. At least give the members of the Senate an opportunity, give them an opportunity to vote on this bill so that we can advance this bill and do the work we got to do in the House, right? In order to try to move it through the House of Delegates, where, and I'll get to more about him in a second, but Chairman Luke Clippinger continues to be a problem on many of these major issues, right? So we already have enough obstacles. We had a strong hearing in the Senate, and so we think it's important for people to urge Bill Ferguson to put that bill on the floor and to ignore the way that Sinclair Broadcasting and Fox 45, David Smith, are weaponizing the looped narratives of violence, activating existing beliefs about notions of inherent Black criminality as a way to discourage people from acting on behalf of the humanity of Black children and their families that are impacted by this practice. So where we are now, and you'll see in some of the action alerts that we put out, that we're still in the process of trying to urge the Senate president to have the Judicial Proceedings Committee put it up for a vote. So that's where we are with that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about something that we're working in collaboration with many other organizations, the Second Look Coalition, ACLU of Maryland, on the Second Look Act. Delegate Cheryl Pastor is the lead sponsor in the House. Senator Charles Sidnor is the lead sponsor on the Senate. And this is a bill that essentially would allow for a person after 20 years to be able to put a motion in for a judge to review the case of somebody who has a long sentence and be able to make an assessment as to whether that person's sentence should be adjusted. The purpose of that is twofold. One, for people to address claims of innocence, right? So there's a period of time where court proceedings were more overtly racist, right, in terms of the nature of how the proceedings went. And so there are folks who have spent long periods of time in jail who will want the opportunity to be able to have their sentences looked at by a judge, right? So that's one rationale for that policy. And if we're clear about mass incarceration, right, which is something that the Maryland General Assembly has acknowledged as a result of some of the policies that it has moved on, right? Justice Reinvestment Act, right? Second Chances Act. So there are a variety of things that the legislature has moved on to address mass incarceration, the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, Anton's Law. So there are a variety of examples where the legislature has acknowledged the impact of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. So we're not dealing in a reality where we should be having to convince them. In a world where they know the way that mass incarceration was engineered, right? You think about the famous quote from Ehrlichman, who was on one of Nixon's advisors, that talked about the use of the images of Black people and drugs and marijuana and criminalize it to criminalize being Black without having to say criminalize being Black, right? So if we're clear about the racist nature of the societal discourses that would seep into a court proceeding, that will result in racism in those criminal proceedings, such that you would have Black people more prone to be serving time for things they didn't do, Black people whose sentences are 20% more than their white counterparts for the same charges, for the same convictions. So there's all this evidence that demonstrates the fact that there are Black folks for whom their criminal proceedings were mired in racism. And so this will provide an opportunity for a judge to look and make that assessment, not automatically get out, to make that assessment. It actually also provides an opportunity for those who spent a long period of time behind bars, who have made the attempt successfully at transforming themselves and have demonstrated an ability to be useful to the community. And you know, one brother I've talked about and had the pleasure of being on a panel with in Annapolis about a month or so ago is a brother, Anthony Muhammad, who was with Baltimore Brothers, who works with the ACLU of Maryland. And he's a brother that, you know, did something when he was, 15 or 16, spent 30 years in jail, almost 30 years in jail, has come out and has been one of the leaders of the work that has been done in Baltimore to reduce homicides and non-fatal shootings, right? So this is a brother who has committed himself to changing his life, right, and being a positive force. And he is someone who can reach people that many of us wouldn't be able to reach, right? Those that are engaged in violent activity, he's able to reach many of them in ways that many of us would not be able to reach them. And so the additional purpose of Second Look is to be able to look at folks like that and to give a judge an opportunity to make the decision that someone like Brother Anthony Muhammad should be able to go out to he's done his time and be able to go out to the community and be a positive force. One of the things that we've talked about a lot on this podcast and a variety of other things that LBS has put out is the way that notions of inherent Black criminality play on the American collective consciousness and impact our ability to legislate rationally on these issues. And what I mean by that is that when you think about Black people who've had some affiliation or contact with the criminal justice system, there is a way that the societal propaganda that we get, the narratives, the images, whether it's every day on the news, you see the image of a young Black man, engaged in some robbery or some violent activity. You think about like much of the societal tropes in pop culture, right? Where people see Black folks engage in the kinds of, criminal, violent street activity, right? That then people associate with being a Black person. Those things impact, right, how people treat and think about Black people, how they legislate issues that would, for the most part, impact Black people. And so part of the challenge that we're dealing with is that there are folks for whom, when they're thinking about this piece of legislation, they're thinking about, oh, we're going to let criminals out of jail. And if we are serious about the fact that mass incarceration and the war on drugs were both instruments of racism and white supremacy, that we have to be clear that when we talk about people who are in jail, we're not talking exclusively about people who are criminals. We're talking about people who, in many respects, as I mentioned previously, were in a situation, right? Maybe they were in a fight in self-defense, someone was killed, and now they're spending, a long period of time in jail, right? That, I don't know that I would describe that person as a criminal, but those people are folks behind bars, right? And so it's important to be clear that the language, the discourses that people are using to talk about the folks who will potentially be let out of jail, that discourse and that language, people are legislating to that, creating an environment where fear is being used. Additionally, one of the things that is also being used is this notion of victims, right? So this creates another opportunity for victims to be re-victimized, those who are victimized by the violent activity of a person who might have their sentences adjusted as a result of this bill becoming law. And we have to be clear that when we talk about victims, we're not just talking about the families of those of whom a crime was perpetuated against. Their pain matters, and it's extremely important. But again, we're not just talking about, again, people who, were engaged in criminal activity, right? There are more complicated circumstances that might lead to a person being killed. In addition to that, right? One of the things that does not get talked about enough, in some cases, the process of restorative practices that result in reconciliation of people who harmed the community in a very deep and devastating way. And so we should not rule out the fact that there are people who are able to get to a place where that restoration was ultimately better for the community, right? Now, again, everybody won't be interested in that, right? And this bill, this legislative effort wouldn't require that. It doesn't require a family to forgive or reconcile with the person that committed harm. But it is something that should be made open as a possibility. And that there are people who've experienced it. There's a really good friend of mine, someone I look up to, a brother named Daryl Green, right? And if you hear his story about someone who killed his family member, right? And over time, he was able to forgive that person and do work with that person. And that work is work that ultimately is better for the community. Again, everybody may not be at a place with that level of transformation. But the notion of, quote unquote, letting criminals out of jail obscures even this kind of substantive conversation about what we're talking about here. So again, wanted to provide just some context for that. That's something that we're paying attention to. Something that, again, there are currently dozens of people who are behind bars that this bill would help them have their cases looked at. Again, some people with innocence claims, other people who have spent a long time in jail, who have been positive forces, in the play, behind the walls. That potentially could be positive forces like Brother Anthony outside the walls. And so that's something that we're paying attention to, and something that we think is going to be very important to try to push it out. Where things are is that bill actually passed out of the Senate last year. So the work that is being done on that is being done in the House of Delegates. And as I kind of alluded to before, Luke Clippinger, who himself, his professional job, his day job, is as a prosecutor in Anne Arundel County. So this is important to understand that Luke Clippinger, who is his boss, is a prosecutor. And one of the things that I've mentioned in previous podcasts is that prosecutors are now engaging in what I would describe as a political backlash against some of the progress that's been made on many of these issues. And so Luke Clippinger, who works for the Anne Arundel County prosecutor, he himself is a prosecutor. And he is someone who, and in fact, there is, as I understand it, information about a letter written from his boss to him as chair to say that second look, that they don't think second look would be something that should be passed. So a part of what we're dealing with is Luke Clippinger, who I think many people would say is compromised on the issue, right? He has a professional interest in many of the things that come before his committee. And this is one of them. And so where we are now is the fight to get second look passed, right, out of the House, because the Senate had already did what it was supposed to do last year. And so the goal is to really have the House push it out, because that was the issue last session. One of the things that happened today, I saw someone who I recognize, who I've known for a little bit now, DeRay McKesson. So, I've written what I think about DeRay McKesson. The thing that you probably will remember the most was in 2018, we, in our kind of personal capacity, were supporting then Senator Joe Carter in a race against a young white guy named J.D. Merrill for the Senate seat in the 41st District. And one of the things that, anyone who's listened to us and knows anything about LBS knows the regard we have for now former Senator Joe Carter, who was one of the most important, impactful leaders on racial justice in the Maryland General Assembly. And so DeRay actually endorsed her opponent. Again, a young white man who, nothing personal against him, but really had no business running for that Senate seat, had no track record of anything close to what Senator Carter has done, and had no perspective rooted in Black liberation, because that wasn't his training or socialization. And so D-Ray, who is considered in many mainstream elite spaces as a racial justice advocate, supported this young white dude against Senator Carter. And what's important to know about, so that gives you a sense of who D-Ray is, right, politically, right, beyond just the language, the rhetoric, but that's who he is politically. And one of the things that the Democratic Party does is that there's certain tricks that it uses to obscure the positions that it takes on certain issues. And one of the ways that they do that is that they will use other issues, bring in folks like D-Ray on those issues to beef up its social justice bona fides to counter actual approaches at racial justice. And this is something that we suspect is a part of what is going on in Luke Klippicher's committee, where there are a set of parole bills, right? Because the thinking is, well, let's just reform parole. Parole is one of the processes by which people behind the walls can get out. There are a bunch of problems and challenges with the parole process. And the reason why you need second look is to provide a process outside of the parole system for people to have their cases looked at and assessments made. But the thinking is that if you address the parole process, then you don't need second look. Then having DeRay McKesson testify on parole bills that would be used to counter second look. Because if D-Ray was serious in terms of the political work around racial justice, then I would imagine that the Second Look coalition, that again, that's been pushing this issue, he would be connected to them, and he would use his platform to pressure Luke Klippicher and the Democratic Party establishment to push forward something that would actually have a real material impact on people that are serving all this time behind bars. His support of the kind of light version of addressing these issues demonstrates the difference between someone from whom the Democratic Party will use to advance small reforms such that they can talk about how great they are on issues of racial justice while leaving intact a major barrier. And that would be not passing the Second Look Act. So it's going to be extremely important for legislators in general, for those who are on the House Judiciary Committee, to be very clear that addressing the parole system does not address what the Second Look Act is trying to address, which is, again, providing an opportunity independent of the parole process where there are a bunch of challenges and moving through that process, that this provides something that is more streamlined and allowing a person to be able to have their case looked at, right? So that's something that is an important note as to how the Democratic Party establishment uses symbolic tweaks to counter more revolutionary policy that folks are trying to push. In addition to that, another piece of legislation we're looking at, Delegate Malcolm Ruff has billed good cause expungement. One of the things that you'll notice is that, over the past several years, there have been tweaks to expungement law because it's quite complicated, right, in terms of expungement policies, like what area or genre of things to make expungible. Well, the good cause expungement, which is something that Senator Carter was sponsoring while she was still in the Senate and Delegate Ruff has picked up, is a bill that simply allows a person to go to a judge, make their case to a judge as to why their record should be expunged, and that be the process, as opposed to all these kind of complicated categories and the like in terms of what constitutes expungement. Again, this is one of those things that should be easy and simple. Now, I understand the mechanics of it, the Maryland judiciary and how they keep records. But if we value the lives of working class Black people, this is an issue that's been an issue for many years, right? And so it is important that this, again, something that's really bare minimum, right? Something that should be moved even further. Another effort, that has been in the works at this point for many years. My sister Monica Cooper and many others have been leading the work around getting a women's pre-release center, right? because that's one of the neglected populations are women who are subject to the criminal justice system, right? So having, resources dedicated to women coming out of the system for them to reintegrate as returning citizens, that is something that, again, has been difficult to move, right? But again, that's something that should be easy if the lives of working class Black people were something that was important. Another piece of legislation that we're looking at, there's a bill sponsored by Delegate Marlon Ampry that will essentially curtail the use of a person's art, in this case, like rap lyrics, a person's art to be used in criminal proceedings, right? Again, another thing that should be relatively simple, just because, art, people have their artistic expression. And what the bill doesn't do is if a person snitches on themselves on a record, that can be used, right? If a prosecutor can prove that the, lyrics or words that are being narrated corroborate other aspects of their prosecution, that this bill would not curtail the ability of a prosecutor to do that. But what this bill would do is that can't be used as a way, because what that can do, particularly in the instance of a hip hop artist or a rapper, is that people already have stigmas about what they think about young Black men. And all those stigmas are amplified when you're talking about rap lyrics as a weapon, as a racialized weapon that in many ways can only be weaponized to maximum power against Black people because of those stigmas and how they operate. And so the notion here is to not use someone's lyrics as a way to essentially raise, to keep them from using rap lyrics as a way to project certain characteristics of inherent criminality onto the person before them, right? The person that is subject to the criminal prosecution. Again, this is another one of those things that Luke Clippinger, who is a Anne Arundel County State's attorney, he's a prosecutor. This is a bill that he and his committee has blocked. Folks who are familiar with our work from before, I mentioned the Child Interrogation Protection Act, where it took a lot. It took a lot of public criticism and pressure to get him to move on that. So this is another example. We're talking about the impact of racism and white supremacy and how it's being weaponized against Black people, right? This is another example of a piece of legislation that Chairperson Clippinger is blocking. And if the Democratic Party, again, is serious about racial justice, this is another easy one, right? This should be easy. We should be talking about much bigger issues. But the fact that this is something that is difficult is a challenge. And then additionally, another thing that we're keeping an eye on and collaborating with our friends at Fight Blight, the issue of maintaining the protection. So Baltimore City has certain protections where unpaid water bills cannot be used to send a property to tax sale. And so if you think about historically, the way that tax sales have disproportionately impacted, Black property owners, particularly elderly Black women, right, who many of them are fixed incomes and don't have the resources or infrastructure to fight against major hedge funds that are seeking these properties, these tax sales in order to advance their own economic interests. And so Black people and working class Black folks, in many respects, are some of the folks that are most vulnerable to this kind of practice. And so one of the things that was a major issue last year was Baltimore protecting itself and retaining those protections for Baltimore City. This is an ongoing thing that we're keeping an eye on as well this session to ensure that Baltimore retains the protection against the use of unpaid water bills to send properties to tax sale, and hopefully extend that protection around the state, because Baltimore isn't the only place where this is an issue. And ideally, we would want this to be something that's a protection that is extended across the state. So again, if people remember, for instance, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and you think about one of the biggest impacts of the Great Recession was, in many ways, it wiped out, right? It significantly decreased and wiped out a bunch of property that Black people own around the country. And Maryland is a state that impacted pretty dramatically, given the fact that you have a Prince George's County, a Charles County, places that have high populations of Black people who are homeowners, that have some level of middle class status or wealth. A lot of that was wiped out as a result of the Great Recession. And so I'm mentioning that to say that we talk about the importance of Black folks' ownership of property, right, as a way of being able to participate in wealth acquisition, and to change our station collectively as it relates to wealth and land ownership. This is something that, again, is important for Baltimore City, but also something that should be extended statewide. And then lastly, something that's actually a core part of our legislative agenda is our work on reparations. So many of you who are watching this have likely heard about our work around reparations for the war on drugs, the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund that we're able to establish on the state level that takes about 35% of proceeds from recreational cannabis, puts it into a fund that could be used to address the harm done by the war on drugs. So I've talked about that in the past. That is separate, related to, but separate than this particular effort. This effort, the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland last year decided that it wanted to put forward a reparations bill that it would formally support. They heard from folks around the state that reparations was something that was important and wanted to put it on the agenda. Some people who follow our work will know that we actually put out what we think is a approach to reparations in Maryland. And so, conversations working with the Legislative Black Caucus landed on a bill that merely studies, established a Maryland Reparations Commission that would study reparations in Maryland and would provide a report to the General Assembly in 2027 on what those recommendations would be, both in terms of policies that the state legislature should endorse and other forms of redress as it relates to private institutions and the things that they should be urged to do. So that is the bill that we're supporting, that we testified in support of. And we think it's a good start. We're looking forward to when that report is done, when that task force does the work. And when that report is done, we're looking forward to doing the work of implementing the recommendations that will come out of this reparations commission. And a part of why we feel confident it'll pass, and a part of why we feel good about it, is because it is a study bill. It is not a bill that in and of itself will distribute resources to Black people. I think there is some value in establishing a task force that will make legislative recommendations. It'll help buttress the effort later on to push those policies to deliver on things that will constitute reparations in Maryland. What I want to end on, again, I've talked a lot about just the general landscape, and I started with the general landscape, the political landscape in Maryland, and in terms of connecting the reparations piece to where I want to land. So, as I mentioned in the very beginning, there is a unfortunate way that we've normalized the plantation, that America is structured as a plantation, that unfortunately many of us have normalized the plantation in our political imagination, that many of us cannot imagine what it would look like for Black people to operate as sovereign, self-determined, independent Black people to advocate unapologetically for our interests. And we think in many respects it's actually fairly bold for the Legislative Black Caucus to put together a package, even if it doesn't go as far as I would have liked it to go, to create a commission to study it and to give recommendations to the legislature for them to act on. It's more bold than I have experienced generally in the legislature on issues like that. But again, not far enough in terms of actually delivering on it right now, which tells us about what the political ceiling is, right? It is extremely important that folks are clear that all the things that I named are things that are bare minimum. These are things that should be easy. As much as we have Black folks who mean well, Black folks who are really serious about wanting to help Black people, even though we have some policies that have moved that have been good, I've talked about some of LBS's, political victories, that we cannot mistake the fact that we have been able to get some of those victories with a fundamental change in the white supremacist nature of the society we live in and of the kind of plantation structure of which the Maryland General Assembly operates. And that this Cold War that is happening within the Democratic Party between the corporate wing and the progressive wing is something that is playing itself out here in Maryland with the added pressure of a governor for whom the Democratic Party has an investment in his national political aspirations. And so that creates what I would describe in many respects as a pretty dire political circumstance. And the reason why I say it that way is because it's going to be difficult for many people to hear criticisms of the Democratic Party, hear criticisms of the governor, right? Hear criticisms of Black folks in political leadership. Right? It's going to be, for some people, it's going to be difficult for people to hear those criticisms because many of those people, if you ask them, and I think they genuinely are sincere in this, they are trying the best they can. The challenge is they're trying the best they can in the context of a plantation structure where there's a ceiling on what it is that Black people can expect to be extracted from the system. And part of what LBS endeavors to do is to invite people to imagine a different approach to politics where we don't normalize the plantation, where we're going to have to engage in the political warfare necessary for Black people to be free, because there's no version of engaging in the political landscape to positively impact the quality of life of Black people that does not require political warfare. One of the things that Kwame Ture once said, formerly Stokely Carmichael, he said that in America, Black people, in order to just get reform, shed our blood. Not even for revolution, just reform requires us to shed our blood. And unfortunately, that has been a big part of what has driven the successes that we have been able to have, is that it has required people's blood to be shed. It has required harm to be done to people in order to create an environment where this legislature acts on issues that impact working class Black people. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a way that the stories of Black people being inherently violent and criminal, take those handful of stories, make them out to be the vast majority of Black folks, that those in many ways undermine people's intensity around looking at the condition of working class Black people and fighting vigorously to change it. So we're in an environment where, given some of the things that I mentioned, many of the things that are baseline, the things that I listed are things that should be simple for a Democratic Party supermajority with a Democratic governor, should be easy. But the challenge that we're dealing with is that many of the things that I listed are things that are going to have trouble passing. I'm concerned about auto charging. I'm concerned. I don't know that it's going to pass this year. And with next year being an election year, I expect them to be even more conservative. So even if you hear people say we'll do it next year is an election year. I expect folks to be more conservative, right? And they're going to be continue to be the same excuses as to why it's not convenient to do it now, right? The Republicans are going to, make you out to be advocates for criminals. And what I say is, be an advocate for working class Black people who Republicans want to characterize as criminals, who want to justify their dehumanization of Black people by using the notion of a criminal to bludgeon them societally. And that is where we are. Second Look may not move out of the House, right? That the effort to use D-Ray to counter what Second Look is, right? This is the political environment that we are in. And in some ways, that when Hogan was governor, there are ways the Democrats behaved more on the side of these progressive policies than they are now. Because again, there's this collective concern embedded in this theory of change that folks have, where an individual person in high office can do good by our community. And it's frustrating because I don't know how many times are we going to have to see this playbook to realize that it doesn't impact the masses of our community. In fact, in many ways, it is counter-revolutionary. It is counter-revolutionary, relying on individual Black people in high offices to deliver for working class Black people. It does not work as a theory of change. And I challenge anyone to debate the history of that. But I'm ending on this point to say that that is where we are in the legislature. And in fact, I am tremendously concerned about the direction of the legislature, because this to me sends a sign that is not promising about the prospect. In many respects, I'm concerned that Maryland may go backwards on these issues. Maryland already, again, incarcerates the highest percentage of its children outside of Alabama. And I'm afraid that Maryland's going to continue to go in that direction. right? I'm concerned that there are going to be all these people who are stuck behind bars that would be better served outside of prison, in the community, doing work to improve the community, being a positive force in the community. I'm concerned that those folks are going to continue to languish behind bars, right? I'm concerned that something as simple as good cause expungement, right, that would help a lot of people, right? Simplifying the expungement policy. I'm concerned that there are going to be people for whom are going to continue to not have access to employment, right? I'm concerned that we're in a state that might use unpaid water bills as the basis for seizing people's property, right? I'm concerned that this political environment, with all the glitz and glam, right, with all the, the smiling and press conferences and symbolic policy gestures, tweaks around the edges, being promoted as change, I'm concerned that that is going to be the dominant culture of the legislature over the next few years. And so I'm sounding the alarm, because many of the issues that I named are issues that we're going to need you more than ever. Just because we have a Black governor and a large Black caucus, we're going to need you more than ever in terms of pushing some of our legislative initiatives and some of the other legislative initiatives that we're watching, in order to ensure that we actually can deliver for our community. And in some ways, this is something that I'm saying that is of great risk, because there are people who have really strong, deep personal investments in people's individual political careers. And then there's some people who en route to their aspiration, not just talking about Westmore, he's included in this, but other folks who have political aspirations. My concern is that those aspirations will be the compass that they use to navigate the political landscape. And with the way that people are interpreting the national election, that is something that I think is important for us to be clear that it's going to be important for you all to continue to press people. Even though people are doing some good stuff, we're going to need to continue to press people even harder to ensure that the legislature doesn't roll in the opposite direction. So that's where I'm likely to end. So Candace is saying that there's a question asking about who's in opposition to second look and auto charging. Here is, yeah, okay. So here's my answer to that. So there is a law enforcement establishment that is comprised of the following. You have the Fraternal Order of Police. Right now, usually their effort is spent mostly on law enforcement specific stuff, but the Fraternal Order of Police, they're usually in lockstep, right? So you have the Fraternal Order of Police. What you also have, and in this instance is the most important, are prosecutors. So the Maryland State's Attorneys Association, prosecutors are the primary folks that are opposed. Now, fortunately, let me give credit, right? Because, Ivan Bates, the state's attorney for Baltimore City, is someone who, I think he was elected on a reactionary political mandate. Very clear about that. And you've heard me on a variety of occasions, on a variety of platforms, be critical of him and his policy position. On issue of second look, giving him credit, he actually has come out in support of second look. So if you're looking for a pressure point, he's actually someone who, again, has publicly endorsed second look, right? So he should get some credit for that. But prosecutors, by and large, generally are opposed to it. Other forces that are opposed to second look are also many of the traditional victims' rights organizations. And so typically those victims' rights organizations, usually the images of the kind of innocent white woman who's, hurt by some Black brute, right? So that's the imagery and stereotype that oftentimes the victim rights organizations leverage in terms of their political salience. That doesn't mean there are Black people that are in some of those groups, right? But I'm talking about the kind of undergirding discourse that is often used from victims' rights organizations. But so that's one of the forces. But the biggest piece, particularly as it relates to second look, generally are prosecutors, again, who testify against those bills. And prosecutors have enhanced their power in Annapolis One of the things that they've done, for instance, is that they've hired a lobbyist, Elisa Harris Malone, which is one of the most successful, well-known, high-power lobbying firms in Annapolis. So they've hired her and hired her firm. So that tells you that they're in the process of beefing up their kind of legislative power to push back. So that's second look. And then auto charging, very similar. Now, Ivan Bates, now I gave him credit for second look. He actually has said that on the record, his friends at Fox 45, he said it on their platform, that he is utterly opposed to ending the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. In fact, I did an interview with Tom Hall on YPR on Midday, where Tom played a clip of Ivan Bates explaining his opposition to auto charging. So prosecutors, and again, this is something that really across the board of many of these issues, but prosecutors, which again includes Scott Schellenberger, Ivan Bates, many of the other prosecutors are opposed to ending the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. In fact, it gives a shout out to the public defender, Natasha Darty, who at a panel, I believe it was somewhere in Howard County, actually was going back and forth with the Howard County State's Attorney, Rich Gibson, who's a brother, who's a prosecutor, who is opposed to auto charging, and Natasha Darty. They were kind of going back and forth. So shout out to Natasha for pushing back against some of the rhetoric from Rich Gibson. But prosecutors and fraternal order police, same thing in terms of auto charging. Now, the thing that I want to raise, and I alluded to this in the beginning, is that there has been a backlash because there was a string of a few years where there's some things that we were able to do, right? Repeal the LEOBR, change the Maryland Public Information Act to allow investigatory records of law enforcement to be disclosable to the public, change of use of force standard. I mentioned the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund, the prohibited use of odor for stops and searches, the Child Interrogation Protection Act, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act. So there was a whole bunch of things that we were successfully able to do. And so in many respects, I think the prosecutors, in conjunction with Sinclair Broadcasting and Fox 45, and it's important, I want people to know, because I'm not just talking about David Smith and Fox 45 to pick on them. It's not a random thing that I'm making an issue out of. If you read the coverage and watch the coverage of Fox 45 on these issues, they talk about policy in ways that a person who's just covering it as the news would not. Right, so they in essence campaigned against the Child Interrogation Protection Act. Like there is an ongoing campaign where they use the stories to then buttress the policies that they want to pursue. Right, the bill from last session, and people remember there was a bill that the Democratic Party leadership, which included Wes Moore, Speaker and Senate President, that you saw all of them support a package that went in the opposite direction of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act. Right, expanding the jurisdiction of Department of Juvenile Services, having the potential of pulling more kids into the system as opposed to providing the opportunities for diversion, right? So we see and Fox 45 treated that bill the way that an advocacy organization treats a piece of legislation, where they were heavily involved in following that all the way through and clearly supporting it. And you only know enough to do that if you're connected to an entity that understands and navigates the policy arena. And that is the role that prosecutors are playing. So, and there was a Baltimore Banner article that came out a couple of years ago when David Smith bought the Sun, where someone recorded the conversation. And David Smith says that he is connected to what's happening in Annapolis. So the connection that I'm making is not an arbitrary connection that I'm deciding to make. David Smith, who's the executive chairman of Sinclair Broadcasting and majority owner of the Baltimore Sun, himself has said that he is paying attention to Annapolis, paying attention to policy. So he is working in conjunction, right? You talk to Ivan Bates, or people who've talked to Ivan Bates, who have said that he brags about his relationship with David Smith, right? So the connection, this is not an arbitrary thing that I'm piecing together or making a conspiracy. It is pretty undeniable. So I'm answering that in relation to the question about the opposition, because it is the prosecutors, FOP, law enforcement establishment, that is being supercharged by the work and the allyship of Fox 45 and its impact on the policy landscape. So that's even more reason. The way I end it, all of this is having such an impact on the policymaking arena in Maryland, and it's creating a dynamic that, quite frankly, I'm very concerned about. All of you should be concerned about, and I'm urging everybody to not take it easy. We're going to need you. Put out action alerts. We need you to make those calls, send those messages, because we're fighting an uphill battle in this political climate in ways that people might not suspect. Because again, we have a Black governor, a large Black caucus, right? It's Maryland. So I think there's a way that people might think, oh, Maryland's fine. And I want to put out the message that actually it is not. In fact, I'm really concerned. And so to really end on this is that's part of the importance of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're able to say these kind of things without the fear of, so-called benevolent white folks who might feel threatened by this kind of message to pull our resources or anything like that. So that's why we really urge people to become sustainers. People who donate to us monthly. If you go on our website, you see the website on the top of the screen. We can go and become a sustainer. So that we continue to bring you this kind of information and perspective on the Maryland General Assembly, because you're just not going to get this from other organizations. Like, you're not going to get this perspective because people want to maintain their relationships. They want to continue to be in the club. And unfortunately, the only club we care about is Black people, right? And so please become a sustainer so that you can help support the work that is necessary for us to continue to put this message out and for us to continue to do the work of advancing the interests of Black people unapologetically. You'll hear from me again soon. Take care. Peace.